Queen Elizabeth II. A name that for 7 decades stood as the unshakable foundation of the British Empire, a woman who carried the secrets of 1,000 years of royalty behind a mask of perfect impenetrable stoicism. But as the iron gates of Buckingham Palace groaned shut, and the world's cameras finally turned away from the state funeral, a far more dangerous and volatile drama was beginning to unfold behind closed doors. The public saw the grief, the pageantry, and the tears, but they were never meant to see what happened in the suffocating silence of the drawing room, where the most powerful family on earth gathered to hear the final, earth-shattering commands of their matriarch. This was the reading of the last will and testament of Elizabeth the Great, a document that would not just distribute jewels and estates, but would effectively dismantle the traditional power structure of the monarchy and ignite a Cold War between brothers, sisters, and heirs. The air was thick with the scent of ancient beeswax and the metallic tang of unspoken anxiety, every ticking second of the grandfather clock sounding like a countdown to a dynastic explosion. But the first shock, the one that left the room paralyzed with a visceral, jagged sense of betrayal, was not what was in the will, but the man who was chosen to reveal it. Prince Andrew, the Duke of York, the outcast. The man who had been stripped of his military titles, banished from public life, and cast into a social wilderness following scandals that threatened to burn the House of Windsor to the ground. Why was he there? Why in a room filled with the King of England? The Princess Royal, and the future of the monarchy was the disgraced son, the one holding the cream-colored envelope. As Andrew stepped forward, his hands trembling with a mix of nerves and a sudden terrifying surge of renewed importance, the discomfort in the room became physical. King Charles III sat with his jaw clenched so tight the muscles in his face jumped, his fingers interlaced with a bone-white intensity. This was his mother's final, calculated move from beyond the grave, a message of trust in her favorite son that bypassed the new king and sent a tremor of instability through the very heart of the crown. Andrew's voice, thick with emotion and perhaps a hint of desperate vindication, broke the silence. "Mommy, Mother, Your Majesty." 3 in 1. It was a greeting that felt like a plea for redemption, a raw human moment that seemed to mock the cold reality of the power struggle about to be unleashed, as the heavy red wax seal cracked a sound that echoed like a gunshot. In that stifling room, the true nature of Queen Elizabeth's final legacy began to spill out. This was not a document of comfort. It was a blueprint for survival, written by a woman who knew that her family was fractured and that her successor was unprepared for the storms ahead. Andrew began to read, his voice gaining a rhythmic, almost haunting quality as he delivered the commands of a dead queen. To Charles, her eldest son, she left the stewardship of Windsor Castle. On the surface, it was a formal acknowledgement of his role as king. But as the reading continued, the stewardship began to feel more like a restriction than a gift. The first true explosion occurred when Andrew reached the section regarding Sandringham Estate, the beloved country retreat, where the family had spent every Christmas for generations. "I have given Sandringham Estate to my daughter Anne." The words hung in the air like a poisonous fog. Sandringham was the personal property of the monarch, a crown jewel in the king's private purse. By stripping it away from Charles and handing the keys to Princess Anne Elizabeth, was fundamentally altering the royal hierarchy. She was rewarding the daughter who had never complained, never sought the spotlight, and never wavered in her duty, while simultaneously cutting the legs out from under the new king. Charles's face turned a shade of bruised purple, a volcanic, incandescent rage bubbling beneath his Savile Row suit. He had spent 70 years waiting for this moment, only to find that his mother had decided to distribute the power he thought was his alone. Anne, the iron-faced anchor of the family, allowed only a single sharp flicker of surprise to cross her eyes. She knew this was a burden as much as a reward, a signal that she was now the true protector of the family's private history. But the Queen was far from finished. The document moved on to Balmoral, the place where she had drawn her final breath, her paradise in the Highlands. In a move that defied every royal tradition, she declared it a shared estate, a collective property to be managed by a committee of family members rather than the king alone. To Charles, this was the ultimate betrayal. Balmoral was his sanctuary, the one place where the monarch could be truly private. Now, he was being forced into a shared purpose with the very siblings who had spent years questioning his judgment. The atmosphere in the room turned toxic. You could feel the shift in energy, the invisible lines being drawn between those who supported the new king and those who were now empowered by the Queen's final commands. Elizabeth was ensuring that no one man, not even the king, could dominate the family's legacy. She was forcing a unity through legal compulsion that they had failed to find through love. Then the focus shifted to the younger generation, and the tension took on a more personal, almost spiritual weight. Andrew read the Queen's instructions for Catherine, the Princess of Wales. To her she left the Vladimir tiara, one of the most breathtaking and historically significant pieces in the entire royal collection. But the gift was not about the diamonds or the swinging pearls. It was about the crown. By giving Catherine the symbol of grace and continuation, Elizabeth bypasses the current generation and anointing Catherine as the true future of the monarchy. It was a coronation of the spirit. Catherine sat with an eerie, unshakable calm, her eyes sharp and observant, acknowledging the weight of the gift without a hint of a smile. She knew that the tiara was a golden shackle, a reminder that the survival of the House of Windsor now rested on her shoulders. She was being groomed to be the Shadow Queen, the one who would hold the family together when the men failed. The room held its breath as the names of Prince George and Princess Charlotte were read. The Queen's words for her great-grandchildren were stripped of all royal artifice. She spoke of treasures and knowledge, but the underlying message was one of crushing responsibility. George was reminded that his life was no longer his own, it belonged to the people. But for Charlotte, the Queen had a special hidden message. She spoke of her spirited nature and her role in maintaining the balance. It was a secret acknowledgement of the warrior princess training that was already underway. Elizabeth knew that Charlotte would be the secret weapon of the next generation, the one who would keep the king in line just as Anne had done for Charles. But the real bomb, the one that threatened to shatter the room into a million jagged pieces, was the mention of Prince Harry. The name itself caused a physical reaction in Prince William. His posture turned to stone, his eyes narrowing into cold slits, as Andrew read the Queen's bequest to her exiled grandson, a ceremonial sword that once belonged to King George VI. The silence that followed was absolute, a void that seemed to swallow all the air in the room. The sword was a symbol of military honor, of family defense, and of the bloodline's strength. By leaving it to Harry, the man who had walked away, who had aired the family's dirty laundry on global television, and who had settled in a California mansion, the Queen was delivering a final, agonizing riddle. Was this an olive branch, a plea for him to return to the fold? Or was it a sharp, silent rebuke, a reminder of the honor he had discarded for a life of celebrity? William struggled to contain a primal, incandescent fury. To him, the sword was a validation of Harry's betrayal. Charles too looked pained, the memory of his youngest son's rebellion, a permanent scar on his coronation year. The reading moved into the final testament, a section that felt more like a ghost story than a legal document. To the youngest Prince Louis, the Queen left a single handwritten letter to be opened only when he reached adulthood. The mystery of that letter hung over the room like a ticking time bomb. What secrets did the longest reigning monarch in history whisper to a boy who would grow up in a world she would never see? Was it a warning? A map to the palace's darkest secrets? The uncertainty added a layer of dread to the proceedings. Andrew, sensing his moment of power was coming to an end, slowed his pace, savoring the look of shock and confusion on his family's faces. He had been the messenger of their discomfort, and for a few brief minutes he was the center of the world again. As Andrew concluded the reading, his voice dropped to a solemn, gravelly whisper. He spoke of the Queen's final wish: unity. She called for mercy in the face of division and strength during hardship. She reminded them that the crown was a symbol of something bigger than their individual egos, their petty jealousies, or their personal vendettas. She acknowledged Princess Anne as the anchor of the monarchy, a quiet, decisive validation that brought a rare, microscopic nod from the Princess Royal. It was a final, silent conversation between a mother and a daughter. But as the family looked at each other, the togetherness the Queen craved felt further away than ever. The will had not united them. It had exposed the fault lines. It had shown that Elizabeth did not trust her son to rule alone, that she saw Catherine as the true future, and that she still held a flame for her wayward grandson in California. When the final page was turned and the heavy cream paper was folded back into its envelope, the silence that followed was different from the one that had started the meeting. It was no longer the silence of secrets. It was the silence of a house divided. The last will of Elizabeth II was a masterpiece of strategic ambiguity. It balanced the need for tradition with the necessity of a modern shared power structure. But as the family began to stand and move toward different corners of the room, it was clear that the War of the Wills had only just begun. King Charles III was the first to speak, his voice firm, but carrying the hollow ring of a man who realized his power was being checked from the grave. He called the will a call to action, a duty they must all embrace. But his eyes never left the envelope in Andrew's hand. He knew that his reign would be defined by the restrictions his mother had placed upon him. Princess Anne remained in her seat long after the others had begun to disperse. She looked at the spot on the table where the document had rested the weight of Sandringham and the role of anchor settling into her spirit. She wasn't one for vanity, but she knew that her mother had given her the power to keep the monarchy from drifting into irrelevance. She was the one who would have to manage the brothers, protect the children, and ensure that the warrior princess training of young Charlotte was completed. She stood slowly, her movements deliberate and strong, the envelope tucked away as she prepared to step back into a world that had no idea of the earthquake that had just occurred inside the palace walls. Outside, the London sky was turning a bruised purple, and the life of the city went on as if nothing had changed. But inside Buckingham Palace, the monarchy had been fundamentally, perhaps permanently, altered. The Queen's will was not a message of peace. It was a final act of governance from a woman who refused to stop ruling even in death. She had given them the tools, the estates, the tiaras, the swords, and the letters, but she had also given them the seeds of their own destruction if they failed to find the unity she demanded. As the lights dimmed in the drawing room, the ghosts of the past seemed to watch the heirs of the future. The secrets of the crown are endless, and the reading of the will was only the first chapter in a new, darker saga for the British royals. The Game of Thrones had entered its most dangerous phase yet, and the world was just beginning to realize that the true power didn't lie in the crown on the king's head, but in the words written by a mother who knew exactly how to keep her family and the world guessing until the very end. The era of Elizabeth was over, but her shadow would loom over the House of Windsor for generations to come, a silent, powerful force shaping a destiny that was now more uncertain than ever. Thank you for staying with us as we uncovered the shocking truths hidden within the Queen's final will. What do you think? Was Elizabeth right to check Charles's power, Or has she set the stage for the fall of the monarchy? Share your thoughts below and stay tuned as we continue to peel back the layers of the world's most mysterious family.